get the PowerPoint up. But thanks everybody for joining us. I'm Matt Gillard, the President and CEO of Michigan's Children. This is our May edition of our Lunch and Learn series. And as always, we're going to have a discussion here, and then we'll open it up to questions for folks at the end. And I'm thankful, especially for all of you for tuning in, but also thankful for the two friends and colleagues and wonderful guests that we have joining me today. We're going to be talking about the budget, the state budget. That's top of mind for everybody in and around Lansing this time of year, obviously, and a lot going on with it right now. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I know people can't see me. My camera's not working on my computer, but we'll get the PowerPoint up and running here shortly as soon as they figure it out. But we'll go ahead and start the conversation. I'll just kind of lay the groundwork on where we're at with the budget. But first, I wanted to let you know who our special guests are today. We've got Jeff Cobb from Ed Trust Midwest and Rachel Richards from the Michigan League for Public Policy. Two great colleagues of mine from two organizations that we work very closely with. You guys want to introduce yourselves real quick? Jeff, you start.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Jeff Cobb. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for Ed Trust Midwest. We are an advocacy organization focused on making sure that all kids have access to a high quality public education.
And Rachel.
Yeah, hi folks. Rachel Richards. I'm the Fiscal Policy and Government Relations Director for the Michigan League for Public Policy. I've kind of done some of these lunch and learns before, so really happy to be back and chatting with y'all. So if you don't know the League, we are a nonpartisan research and advocacy organization that works on kind of bettering health, educational, and economic security outcomes for all Michiganders, but really focusing on Michiganders who are kind of systemically and historically left out of the system. So really happy to be chatting with y'all about the budgets, one of my favorite topics, and looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. And like I said, thanks everybody for tuning in. So I'll kind of lay the groundwork and then we'll get right into a conversation. So we are really kind of at the critical stage here for our state budget negotiations. So if you remember, this process started back with Governor Whitmer presenting her budget proposal for the next fiscal year. So we're talking about the state budget that for the fiscal year that will start October 1st of this fall, October 1st of 27, and run for 12 months through the end of September of 2028. We call it the fiscal year 28 budget, but it actually goes into effect or starts October 1 of this year. And so this process started with the governor presenting her budget proposal to the legislature. The legislature then takes that proposal, and each chamber, the House and the Senate, pass their own versions of a state budget. And that's where we're at kind of in the process. And the other chamber considers those budgets, and ultimately the differences between the House and the Senate need to be worked out, and a final budget passed by both chambers in identical form, both the House and the Senate, needs to be presented to the governor. Now, the deadline for this is to happen is July 1st, but if you remember by last year, that deadline was not met. One of the challenges is that there's no real consequences for the legislature if they do not meet that deadline. And so last year we ran into a scenario where a budget wasn't passed, even up until past the official start of the fiscal year, October 1st. And this created a lot of challenges for local governments, for school districts, and a lot of other folks that depend upon state funding and knowing what their state funding is going to be to continue to operate. And so this was a challenging time, certainly for all of us advocates and everybody, like I said, that's interested in or depends upon state funding. The good news as of this point, at least, and we'll talk a little bit more about this with our panelists, but the good news as of this point, at least, is that we are on track to get a budget passed and to have this process done and completed by July 1st. All parties involved have maintained throughout the year, throughout this so far, that is their intention, that they're very eager to get this done and get out of town, frankly, and get back to campaigning. They're all up for re-election this fall, so it makes sense from that standpoint as well. But also, I think everybody involved took a lot of heat last year and was not, did not look good coming out of the process as it played out last year. So there does certainly, at this point at least, seem to be intentions and the expectations that this will be done here basically within the next month and a final budget presented to the governor by July 1st. And so that's kind of the background on where we're at. Like I said, we're at the process now where both chambers have passed their full budget proposals, so we can see where the differences lie between the House and the Senate and the governor. And now negotiations have already started to some extent, but will really start in earnest next week. Important side note here, as we're speaking, a lot of the Lansing insiders and a lot of the legislators are up on Mackinac Island for the annual Detroit Regional Chamber Policy Conference. So there is no session this week in the legislature, so nothing formally happening. But we do expect negotiations to really kick off in earnest next week. The other important date to note that just happened last week or the week before, I guess, was the May Revenue Estimating Conference, which is when the economists get together and do one more estimation on how much revenue the state will have to spend in the next fiscal year. And those are the numbers, the final numbers that then the legislature will use to craft the final budget proposal. So that process is done as well. Revenues showed, fairly steady, actually up a little bit. Not significantly, but up a little bit. The other point I'll make in this kind of background as well is that this is a challenging budget year for the state. And we knew that going in. There's two really big reasons why. One is that the changes that were made at the federal level with the reconciliation bill, the one big beautiful bill that they call it, that passed last year, are starting to come into effect. The big impact of that bill was shifting a lot of the costs for programs like Medicaid and SNAP from the federal government to the state government. So in order to maintain those programs, more state resources are going to be needed to be put into those programs. And so that puts obviously a strain on our state budget. And then receiving less federal money. The other thing that can't be ignored as well is the end result from last year's budget negotiation was a kind of a long-term road funding plan that the state enacted. And this also is dedicating a significant amount of state revenues specifically to road funding or to transportation funding for the next several years or ongoing. And so that as well is putting a damper on state revenues for other things. So those two factors combined, created the scenario where we knew going into this process that this was going to be a difficult budget year for the state, meaning there's not a lot of extra money around and difficult decisions are going to have to be made. But as always, passing a budget is an issue in priority setting. And so the legislature has an opportunity, along with the governor, to show all of us and to determine where they think the priority should be as far as state spending. And so with that, I'll kind of pause on the background. And I will let Stephen, you want to roll through the slides here? Thanks. I'm sorry, we got the slides up now. Hopefully you can see them. You can identify yourselves in the chat, and then remember to put any questions you have either in the chat or in the chat throughout the program, and we'll get to you when we can. All right. So there's kind of our opening slide. The guests introduce themselves. We can roll through to the next one. Okay, and we're going to start right now with, we'll turn to my colleague I didn't introduce yet, Pam Cornell Allen, who works with us closely at Michigan's Children, to talk a little bit about a specific issue in the budget that we're trying to bring some attention to that doesn't get maybe as much attention as some of the other things. We'll talk with Jeff and Rachel broader about revenues in general, some of the health and human services issues, and education funding. But one issue in particular we wanted to highlight, I'll let Pam kind of jump on here.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Pam Cornell Allen, and I am a program and policy consultant with Michigan's Children. So as Matt said, I'm going to get us started here by spending just a few minutes talking about one aspect of the budget, and that is the line item that supports programming for youth who have run away or are experiencing homelessness. As background, Michigan's Children has a long-standing partnership with the Michigan Network for Youth and Families. The network is made up of the 22 or so agencies that the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services contracts with to provide critical services like crisis intervention, shelter, counseling, case management, and other supports to runaway and homeless youth. Back in fiscal year 23, after more than a decade of flat funding, the funding allocation for this work was increased with the aim of achieving statewide coverage and program expansion. Now, it took a bit of time to get all of the puzzle pieces into place, but as of last fall, all 83 counties in the state now have a designated runaway and homeless youth provider. That means for a young person in crisis anywhere in the state, there is a resource for them. However, there's always a however, right? What we see from the all three of the recent budget proposals that have been released for next year is a potential reversal of course in the statewide coverage that has been achieved being put at risk. So the current allocation for this line item is $13,126,100. For next year, what was proposed by both the governor's office as well as the Senate is about a 4.5% reduction. So that amount is $12,533,800. And then when the House released their version, there was even a steeper decrease, about 10%, which equates to $11,837,900. So what I want to stress is that any decrease in the funding would have significant impacts on the agencies and the programs that they provide. We are talking about staffing reductions, programs being scaled back, and coverage areas being shrunk. So essentially the coverage map could go back to looking like a piece of Swiss cheese with big holes. So the network is mobilizing. They're doing some coordinated outreach and education with state legislators and specifically talking about the potential impact of these cuts. But we are hoping everyone on this call will also join this effort. We have developed some tools that you can use through our action network. You will be able to send a message to your state legislators, urging them to preserve the funding and to make sure that there is high quality services for runaway and homeless youth available in every corner of Michigan. So with that, I will pause and see if anyone else would like to comment on this topic or if there are any questions.
Well, I'll just add in, obviously, you highlighted the fact that Michigan's Children's partnered with the network for several years. And obviously, this is an issue that's, right in our wheelhouse. And one, like I said in the beginning, I think doesn't get as much attention maybe as some of the other issues that we, often hear about more from an advocacy perspective. So we just wanted to highlight this because we know that folks that tune into our programming feel the same way we do and feel that this should be a critical component. And as we talked about before, that budgets are an exercise in priority setting. This should certainly be a priority for legislators and the governor's office here in Michigan. But I think this also, is an example of an indicator of how we are in a difficult budget situation. And general fund dollars just are not, there's not a plethora of general fund dollars available. And so, without the willingness to raise revenues, and now it's important to note the governor did propose some revenue increases along with her budget proposal, but the legislature is yet to address any of those. And without the willingness or ability to raise revenues, difficult decisions are going to be made. But this is not one that we think makes a lot of sense, especially with the work that we've done in the recent years to grow the support of these networks or this network and these providers.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Pam. And like I said, if you have any questions at any time about this or anything else that we talk about, please dump them into the chat at any point during the program, and we'll certainly get to them. So, as I said before we introduced our other guests, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and let Jeff kind of highlight some of the aspects of the school aid budget and the education funding in particular, just with Ed Trust Midwest, who's a great partner of ours at Michigan's Children as well. So go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on. I'm not going to go over like a bunch of numbers because of that. It would be kind of, boring to go over all those specifics. But what I do want to highlight is that this is actually, we're a lot farther along the process, and it's been a much easier process this year than last year for sure. And I think part of that is being driven by the political reality that there was so much pushback on and how dysfunctional things were. And so I think the House and Senate both got the message like we need to have a budget on time. And I think the House got the message that they can't go around and have drastic cuts like they tried to do last year. And so what you're seeing is actually there's a lot of alignment between the House and Senate and governor's budgets in terms of school aid. They both provide increases for early, Great Start Readiness Program. They both provide increases for the Opportunity Index, which drives funds to at-risk youth and districts with high concentrations of poverty. All of them have an increase for English learners. There's a large focus on literacy and funding professional development and tutoring and learning coaches. And so I think that there is a lot there that they can work with. Now, there's still some things that they're kind of far apart on, which is kind of typical. The House has some funding for to create like a list of math curriculums that you would have to choose from to use, which is probably a good thing. I mean, we did the same thing for our early literacy curriculum, so the Senate does not include that. The House also would give a full foundation allowance to the cyber charter schools. The Senate wants to reduce that. So there's a couple things there. The Senate's interested in creating a new line item for school libraries, which we think would be a great idea. It could help address, literacy. It's been shown that if you have a library in your school, you can improve reading scores. So I think from our perspective, we're hoping that we can just continue to make progress around the areas that are really critical. And again, that's funding the Opportunity Index. The Senate actually has a 15-year plan to fund the Opportunity Index and to fund English learners and to fund and to increase the foundation allowance. So they want to put that into like into law to kind of force the hand. Frankly, we'd like to do that a lot sooner. So, I mean, I think if we wait 15 years, that's a long time, but it gets us on the right track, right? And it continues to drive the discussions about how important it is to provide, additional funding for students that need it the most. Uh, I would say one of the other things that's in the House budget is they also provide $40 million for private tutoring. So I think that's a discussion that we have to have. Are the schools equipped to provide enough services and resources, or should we give dollars to families to do private tutoring? I'm not convinced of that. I think we should probably invest in our schools instead, but that's something the House is included. And I would also want to say that there are some language in the House bill that does give us a lot of pause. It's anti-DEI language that would penalize districts for including that. We really think having a diverse curriculum that is really relevant to everyone, all students, can be really impactful and can drive learning. And so we're hopeful that that language comes out in conference committee. Uh, so I guess I'm feeling optimistic about this budget. Maybe it's misplaced optimism, or maybe my cynicism is lacking this year. But I really do think that we have a chance to get things done on time, and I think we have a chance to make investments in the students that need the most help. And so I'll turn over to Rachel and have her chat and share her perspective.
Thanks. Go ahead, Rachel, and then we'll get into some questions I have for you guys.
Yeah, so I'll thanks Jeff for highlighting kind of what you're seeing in that K-12 space. I'm going to highlight a couple of other spaces where I think is really important for children and families. The first is, and kind of similar to what Jeff said, the good news is that we actually have proposals on the table that actually, have either some agreement, if not in terms of actual dollar amounts, but in terms of like conceptually, yes, we need to fund these things, and need to provide some additional support for either the state or for beneficiaries within SNAP or Medicaid. So good news is that we have the ability to hopefully advocate and talk about what we need in these lines. So the first area that I want to talk about is really, as Matt noted, one of the drivers of kind of our budget conversation this year and in the next handful of years is really going to be around the implementation of the federal mega bill from last year. Good news, all three proposals that are on the table actually, fully fund our SNAP administrative costs. Part of that federal budget, federal reconciliation bill last year shifted more of these costs onto the state. Instead of splitting SNAP 50-50, we now have to put in 75% of the admin costs while the federal government only picks up 25%. So good news, those dollars are in there. They're going to be in there to help make sure that we can continue drawing down all of those federal dollars, federal SNAP dollars, to really help put groceries and food, groceries in the refrigerators and in the pantries, and food on the table. Where we saw a little bit of difference across all three budgets is really around how we're going to administer and staff up our state departments and agencies in order to help support the implementation of HR 1. Again, kind of good news is that they all have little bits in there. They all are providing additional funding. They're providing some additional staff, recognizing that, we need people in order to make sure that families are receiving their food benefits and are able to stay on Medicaid, and that we need people in order to make sure that we are complying with all of those federal laws. So the good news, they're all there, but there's going to be some differences among the three in terms of how many new staff and how much additional support we give to the state departments for that. The one piece I would highlight, and Matt alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that there are some significant differences across the budgets on how we provide some long-term sustainability for Medicaid, recognizing that all of these costs are going to ultimately shift to the state. The governor had proposed a $400 million withdrawal from our rainy day fund, recognizing that for a lot of families that rely on SNAP and Medicaid, it is raining and it's going to continue to pour outside as they grapple with all of these new changes. The Senate proposed a $350 million withdrawal. The House did not withdraw anything. The piece that we did also see, unfortunately, is that the governor proposed, about $800 million in new revenues, including an increase on tobacco taxes, so cigarette and what are known as other tobacco products, so moist snuff, cigars, cigarillos, and the like. We haven't touched tobacco taxes in, I think, 22 years. So kind of recognizing that, this is a space where, not only is there a direct public health reason for taxing cigars and cigarettes, it makes sense as this is a place that we haven't touched in a while. She also proposes implementing a new tax on vaping products. Michigan is one of 16 states that doesn't tax vape. We're the only Great Lakes state that does not tax vape. So you could go to Indiana or Ohio and you would be paying a tax on vape products anyway. So again, common sense, common ground proposal on the table to really help support and maintain long-term Medicaid revenues, not included in any of the budgets. And the last one I would highlight would be an increase to our online and sports betting taxes. Michigan recently implemented online gaming and sports betting. And, just the direct link to public health and, that it just makes sense that this would be a place for us to kind of take a look at a way to raise revenue. So that is one place I want to highlight that, there's definitely some opportunity for advocacy there. The other place, so I'm going to do two more. One is, really in the economic security space. The good news is there's alignment between the governor and the Senate in terms of maintaining ongoing support for RX Kids. I'm sure folks on this call are aware of what RX Kids is. It is, a prescription, a cash cash prescription program for pregnant people and infants in the first 6 months to a year of their life. So really providing kind of a down payment on Michigan families at a time in which could be a real economic crisis or create some real economic instability. We've been providing about $20 million of temporary assistance, federal temporary assistance for needy families, dollars to help support and expand this program. It's currently in 42 communities statewide. It recently announced an expansion to an additional 20 communities statewide. So we're really starting to see communities take up, this approach to really get families cash. And unfortunately, this was a space where the House decided to completely eliminate this ongoing support. So we're really hoping that to have conversations to making sure, this is a real great bipartisan um, program and we see support in it from Republican members in the UP and in northern Michigan to Democratic members in southeastern Michigan and on the west side of the state. So again, bipartisan, common sense, common ground solution that we hope is in the final budget. And then finally, the one place where we think that there needs to be a little bit more work, and we unfortunately, didn't see a lot of movement on is really in the early childhood space. We think the House is really taking a step backward in terms of reducing our child care scholarship payments. These are payments that we make to providers that provide care for kids that are living at below poverty or in low income families. And additionally, the House recommends moving to a payment standard that is based on attendance rather than enrollment. And this is just going to create more instability for our child care providers who are already, dealing with ups and downs, and already having to deal with kind of they have budgets, they have rent, they have a lease, they are required to comply with certain licensing requirements, and having them, to now have to track, the all of these kids and only receive payments on the days when they're there just kind of creates that budget instability. And then I guess the one I'll end on a bright side that we saw is, so if folks remember the current budget year, we the state budget essentially eliminated what's known as our early childhood block grants. And these are what are known as our Great Start collaboratives, and help support the coordination of early childhood systems. So whether a child needs access to early or referral to early on, or a family needs access to home visiting programs or, early literacy, that's what these Great Start collaboratives and these Great Start networks really served as, is that coordination system. Well, we eliminated the funding. Vast majority of these systems have since collapsed. So the good news is that all three budgets recognize that we need to put that back into place in order to make sure that families have that coordination effort and to be able to receive the services that they're going to get. But there's some vast differences in how each of the budgets allocate those dollars. So, for example, the Senate, is going to be Senate budget recommendation is heavily reliant on what's known as this Help Me Grow model, whereas the governor and House budgets are a little bit more flexible in the type of model or the type of service provision that is given through these funds. So I will stop there and turn it back over to Matt and see if he has anything additional that he wants to add that I did not highlight.
No, thank you for that. No, I think you nailed the good spots or the bulk of it for sure. I should have said this in the beginning. So all of this information and some of it in even table form where you can easily compare is available in our budget basics. And you can find that in our latest bulletin or maybe the previous bulletin, but also on our website. And so, I think both Jeff and Rachel highlighted a lot of where we're at and where we see things stand and really where the opportunities are for us to weigh in as advocates here in this part of the process to make sure that our voices are heard and that hopefully the priorities that we want to see are enacted or adopted in the final version that goes through. And so, as Rachel highlighted, we saw basically flat funding from both the governor and the Senate on the CDC, the Child Development Care Scholarship Program. We saw a reduction, actually, about 3.6% from the House. And then that language, that troubling language, to shift back to attendance. We've worked hard as advocates to move us into paying payments based on enrollment, which we know is what the industry requires, and we've seen that nationally as well take hold under the Biden administration. Unfortunately, we're seeing this being driven even from the federal level by a lot of the conservative and the Trump administration folks. This movement back towards paying based on attendance, and it's all wrapped in this notion of fraud, or this idea of eliminating fraud in these public assistance programs, which is something that we're certain is going to continue to be an issue that's discussed right through the campaigns and through the elections. One area of positivity, I guess I'll point out as well, is we did see a more substantial, we saw a small increase in early on funding, I think 6.1% in both the governor and the Senate's proposal. So about a $1.5 million increase. We saw a bigger increase, a $5 million increase from current levels in the House proposal. And so this is, stands out as a bit of an anomaly and really, I think, an opportunity where we've seen the House increase funding for a program that we know is important and serves communities well, our early intervention program early on. And so we're hopeful to build upon that. And then, as Rachel noted as well, it's great to see all three versions of the budget to this point agree on at least funding levels for the early learning partnerships to replace the funding that was lost from the elimination of the Great Start Collaboratives last year. And the RX Kids, as Rachel pointed out, is a big sticking point here as negotiations move forward as well. So that's one thing I'll just note quickly on childcare before I get into some questions I have for our panelists. Maddie and I from Michigan's Children were actually out in DC last week, meeting with our congressional members with the First 5 Years Fund, one of our national partners and advocates from 15 other states, specifically on child care and early childhood funding, and really received a pretty positive response, which was expected, I think, from the Democratic members, but even from the Republican members. There's clearly a desire to talk about things other than ballrooms and slush funds and the other things that they're being forced to talk about, especially from Republican members of Congress. And so they were very, I think, excited to be talking about things like childcare. So we're hopeful that despite the chaos and the uncertainty of the political climate in Washington, that we'll be able to build bipartisan support moving forward, or continue, I guess, with the bipartisan support moving forward around issues like childcare and early learning. But we know that, we certainly still need to do everything we can at the state level. And that's why this concern around the Child Development and Care, the CDC program, is particularly acute because, like I said, we saw no increase from the governor and the Senate, and even a decrease in our child care funding from the House, which obviously is unacceptable. All right. Well, thank you guys for that overview. And like I said, all this information is available. Maybe Stephen or Kali, somebody can put the link to the budget basics in the chat so people can pull it up quickly too if they want to, or have it to save. All right, Jeff, I got a quick question to start kind of the conversation with you. One of the things we hear a lot about is this notion that the school aid fund is being raided, right, to pay for things that are typically paid for with general fund dollars. And we know, those of us that work in this on a daily basis know that this, idea or process started long ago. Mostly it's tied to Governor Granholm back when I served in the legislature 150 years ago. But it's been an ongoing issue certainly, obviously, especially in times when budgets are tough or monies are short. But talk a little bit or explain to folks kind of what they're hearing about and what this notion of is, this kind of fluidity between school aid fund and general fund that we see as a constant in the budget debate every year now.
It was so like Rachel and Matt both mentioned, general fund revenues are down. So general fund pays for basically everything except for K-12. School aid fund pays for K-12, and generally we see an increase in funding year after year. It kind of grows. It's based on sales tax revenue and some income tax revenue. And so what happens is there's a lot of pressure then to take money from the schools and move it into community colleges or higher ed, and then you free up those dollars then to be spent on other parts of the budget in the general fund. So it's like Matt said, it's been happening for the last 20 years. There seems to be a bipartisan interest in protecting those dollars, making sure they're designated for school aid. But when the rubber hits the road and they need to balance the budget, it's just so easy for the leaders or for whoever just to kind of take those dollars and balance the budget. And so when you think about it, it's over $1 billion, I think, is what they took last year. And so you think that what you could do with $1 billion for schools, you could provide a lot of supports and services for students who are struggling reading. You could really improve the life of all the students. And so we're definitely a proponent of protecting those dollars, keeping them in the school aid budget. But I think it speaks to a larger question too about revenue overall for the state. And so we're kind of constantly have this lagging general fund revenue and to pay for our basic expenses. And so I think the state needs to take a hard look at that and see what they do to raise those revenues and then, and then protect the school aid dollars to make sure they're going directly to the schools. Hey, Matt, I forgot to mention one other thing, if you'll indulge me. I
Sure.
also wanted to mention that just last week, the House also passed a proposal to eliminate the state education tax. This is the 6 mills that's on your property taxes. It goes to schools, raises about $3.2 billion annually. And so they passed that. They passed the bill to repeal that. It's part of a broader effort to reduce property taxes, which may or may not be a good thing. I don't know, but I think what's left out in the story of reducing property taxes is the amount of the problem it's going to create in terms of funding for our schools and for our local governments. There is a bill that was supposed to be tie-barred to replace that revenue by raising a sales tax or creating a sales tax on services. Uh, that bill did not get a hearing or did not get a vote on the House floor last week. It's a little unclear what services would be taxed, at what level they would be taxed, how much revenue it would actually generate, would it fully reimburse school districts? And so I think that gives me a little bit of pause and I also wonder if this will become part of the budget negotiations. I don't think that I, I, I would not recommend making it part of the budget negotiations, but the House does need some leverage, right? And so we'll see. So that's the one thing that could slow down some of the
Yeah.
momentum we have of getting things
Yeah.
done by July 1st. So I just want to
Thanks for
point that out.
highlighting that. And I'm going to get into that in more detail here in a second. Just quickly before we get into that, Rachel, do you have anything to add on this just 20-year-old notion of kind of fluidity between school aid fund and general fund? And what I would say is not only is general fund not hasn't been growing as much, but really the added pressures we see now, some federally induced, like I talked about from the reconciliation bill, but then also what we did at the state level have created more pressure on the general fund and not the school aid fund. So I mean, if we're gonna continue our Medicaid program at the level it was, those are going to have to be general fund dollars to do that. If we're going to continue our SNAP program at the level it's been funding with the reduction in federal funds, those are going to have to be general fund dollars to do that. And so that creates added pressure on the general fund, which makes the school aid fund even more of a target. To your point, Jeff, that it's out there, it's the easy solution when you have these big holes in the general fund. But Rachel, anything on that
Yeah.
before we get into more detail on the property tax issue?
No, I mean, I think Jeff, really hit the nail on the head with it. With as our school aid fund is healthier. Even when we're talking about that massive road funding proposal that they passed last year as part of the budget agreement, I mean, lawmakers ostensibly held the school aid fund harmless as part of that conversation, really just shifting money from the general fund over to the school aid fund. Now, this just creates a situation where we have a healthier school aid fund and a less healthy general fund. And so, like, unfortunately, as we've seen, as that school aid fund is healthier, it just creates that fungibility in terms of dollars. Now, I'll say technically The use of school aid fund dollars for community colleges and higher eds is legal. It's part of the constitutional provision that was put in place during Proposal A, but it probably wasn't what folks were thinking of when they voted on Proposal A in 1994. Now, I'll acknowledge I was 11, so I wasn't one that was voting on it, but I'm sure, it's like if you talked with a lot of folks that were around, it was all around saving money for schools and making sure that we could fund our public schools. Um, at a time in which we were talking about drastic cuts to public school funding. So I would say, that kind of as we've created these general fund crunches, it's a place where we've gone. And then adding to Matt's point about kind of some of these federal pressures, as I said, this is not going to be just a one-time, implementation of HR1. We're going to have more things that are growing. They're going to add more budget crunches, especially on the general fund side of things. One of those is for the first time in the history of the SNAP program, states are going to have to contribute a portion of SNAP benefits. SNAP benefits are typically 100% federally funded. Michigan brings in about $3.2 billion in SNAP benefits for the over a million Michiganders that rely on SNAP. Because of where our like so-called error rate or improper payment rate is, Michigan could be asked to put in up to $320 million of its own funds in the next couple of years, which again, then what do you not fund on the general fund side of things in order to make hold that harmless? So I think Jeff hit the nail on the head, and that this is just kind of one of those spaces that we've seen this growth in it, and I don't see it slowing down.
Yeah, no, I agree. And just one thing I'll just add, and I know I'm in the minority on this, that holding out belief, but even though so we saw the governor in her proposal include these revenue proposals that Rachel highlighted when she earlier, and we have yet to see even the Democratic controlled Senate, let alone the Republican controlled House, make any effort or movement or even indication that they're openly considering these things. That said, having lived through this from a strategic standpoint, certainly it doesn't make sense for either one of these chambers to jump out front and say yes and just pass it without commitment that it's going to happen from the other chamber. But oftentimes these things come together in negotiations in the later stages of something like a budget. And I think particularly this year, I hold out some hope that there is still a potential. From Michigan's children's perspective, we really like the tobacco and the vape tax, not only for the revenue that we think is desperately needed to shore up these programs, but just from a public policy standpoint, they make it more difficult and certainly lead to lower participation rates for smoking and vaping from young people, especially when you can increase the costs. And so there's a public policy benefit alone, let alone the revenue. But obviously the revenue, and the governor did a good job in her budget proposal of dedicating that revenue specifically to these programs that are going to need the funding here as we transition away from federal funding or full federal funding for these programs. And so I still hold out hope that we could still see some of this come together. There's some indications. I don't want to get too big into the weeds, but even the House and Senate versions of the budget that are purporting to hold Medicaid harmless and to hold these programs harmless, that there's some accounting gimmicks or some funny math involved in that I think would open the door for the governor or the administration to say, well, this doesn't really balance. If we want to compete, if we really want to have these levels, we're going to need to do something on the revenue side to address that. So I think that they're not necessarily off the table, even though we haven't seen them from the House or the Senate yet. Now, like Jeff alluded to, I want to jump into this. So one of the other things we've heard consistently, certainly starting from the House, even the governor's alluded to it, and we've seen proposals even from the Senate, is this notion of property tax reform and reducing property taxes. This is certainly not something that's the forefront of Michigan's children's agenda, but at least is getting some political discussion. I'm my estimation, my guess would be that a lot of this is politically driven, right? They want things to talk about heading into the campaign. But as Jeff said, I mean, the first real stab at this that we've seen is last week, the House passed on a marathon vote. They actually had to pull back a member that used to be a Democrat that hasn't voted in like 10 months, showed up out of the no, out of the blue from to vote for it. But they passed it on a party line vote, essentially. This elimination of the property tax, a big elimination of the property tax in Michigan creates about a $3.2 billion hole, as Jeff said, to schools and local governments. They were able to muster the votes, even despite the very significant opposition from all of the local school groups and the public education groups, as well as the local government and other groups as well. They were able to get the votes to do it. However, earlier in this process, when they kind of started to unveil the details of what they were going to propose, the House, they made it clear that they were considering their proposal revenue neutral, meaning that they would make up whatever it was in total revenue that they're cutting in property taxes with some other form of revenue. And they indicated that it would be a sales tax on services, which, there is certainly validity to. As one of the few people who probably left talking in this world who lived through this back 20 some years ago, when we actually did pass for a short, a hot second, a sales tax on services in Michigan, and then quickly got repealed and replaced with a business tax. There is some real arguments to be made on why it makes sense to expand our sales tax and services. Michigan's economy has shifted from a goods-based economy to a service-based economy. Frankly, all of the United States has. But in Michigan in particular, that shift has been fairly significant over the last few decades. And so, without taxing services, we continually run into revenue challenges at the state level when so much of our economy is driven by service-based industries. And so, there's an argument for long-term growth, long-term sustainability of revenues to implementing a service tax. Now, how that gets done is another whole political animal. Every service that you can think about taxing has an interest group and lobbyists and everybody else who are going to be screaming and hollering about it. So, as Jeff indicated, the important part to note at where we are right now with this is the House has not unveiled any plans about what their service tax proposal would look like. The bill is tie-barred. The property tax cut is tie-barred to a bill that is basically a vehicle bill that is a shell at this point, is empty of any real implementation or any real taxes to be implemented. But all of that said, they did the easy part from a political standpoint. They passed the property tax cut part, but they did not do the hard part, the replacement of the revenue side. And so, my take is similar to Jeff's. The speaker did make some indications as this vote was happening or after the vote last week that they'd like to see this become a part of the budget negotiations. The fact that they consider this revenue neutral gives them an easy out to kind of walk away from that. But I think, it remains to be seen how this plays out. And this is certainly the one issue. There's probably a couple others. But the biggest issue that could kind of derail the train off the tracks here and get us off track, hopefully not, I'm knocking on my desk here, to having this budget completed by July 1.
Yeah, I would just say, I think the discussion should not be about, just simply reimbursing. If we're going to raise a tax on services, we should be talking about increasing revenue and funding our priorities, especially when you consider, like, we're going to get increases for the Opportunity Index, we're going to get increases for English learners, but they're still underfunded by, hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. Our special education funding needs to be revamped, and it's underfunded by, over $1 billion. And so just simply passing a sales tax on services that maintains the status quo, I don't think it really moves us in the right direction. And so I think as part of these discussions, we need to have a real conversation, like, what are our priorities? What are we willing to pay for? And right now, I don't think there's a lot of broad agreement on that between the House and Senate. So that would be my.
Well, and I was going to say, add to Jeff's point about kind of the revenue impact. As you said, the set is, a little over, $3 billion. They also eliminated a one-time tax that is done at the time of, transfer of property called the state real estate transfer tax. This is another $500 million that goes to the schools. If you're taking a look at those two together, you're looking somewhere in the 3.5, a little north of $3.5 billion. Now, I just did some back of the napkin calculations. the repeal of the set will save me about $500 a year. I mean, based on where my taxable value is. Now that $500 that I save though is going to cost us about $2,100 in just our foundation allowance. Like if we just did an across the board cut, it's $2,100 per pupil, taking us from about the $10,000 amount that we're in right now to below $8,000. Now we haven't been below $8,000 in like 15 plus years in terms of what our foundation allowance looks like. And so if you can imagine trying to teach a kid today based on something where like my kid wasn't even born yet, back when we were talking about foundation allowance amounts at that level. It also is things like, universal school meals, which all budgets agree that we need to be continuing to fund. It's funding for, mental health and school safety, which all budgets agreed that we need to fund at some level. So these are, some real these are some real impacts that we could be having on our schools, not to mention the local government services side of things. And like I said, it's not just the $3.5, billion for schools, but it's also about an additional billion to $1.5 billion on our local government services. So it's, the fact that you can call and have EMS come and pick up, if your elderly neighbor falls. It's the fact that your streetlights, work. You have safe communities. All of those things are put at risk based on some of the what we're talking about. And as Jeff said, we shouldn't be talking about status quo. Status quo shouldn't be good enough for our kids, for our families. We need to be talking about what we really need in order to not just survive, but thrive.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more with what both of you said. And I will say this again, just to reiterate, the service tax idea is not a bad one. Using it just to replace a massive cut in property taxes is not what we would be interested in, but there is certainly benefits to be talking about when we talk about expanding the sales tax to services
Yeah, Matt,
in a service-based
I
economy.
was around back when we did it the last time too. I recall those late nights in the Senate, sleeping on the Senate chairs there. Those were good times. Let's hope we don't have to go through that again, though.
Yeah, that was bordering up on the October deadline. Let's hope we don't see that again. Well, we are running up on 1 o'clock. I did see some comments in the chat. Thank you, and I agree, Nina, that what happened in other states as far as fraud should not be an impact on Michigan. But I think the reality is it's becoming quite clear that this is going to be a conversation that's going to persist to throughout the election. This is an issue that certain candidates certainly are going to jump on, and we're going to have to just be prepared for and continue to talk about the benefits of these programs, and why they're successful and why they're so needed here in Michigan, and that we should be talking about increasing support for them, not making it harder for families and children to access the services and the benefits they need, whether it be childcare, SNAP, Medicaid, across the board. And so that's where we're at. So, this is a critical time, as we talked about before. First, before I close out, Rachel or Jeff, anything else we want to add that we didn't get to? All right. Well, I want to thank our guests. Thank you, Pam, as well. Remember, the Runaway Homeless Youth funding as well is a critical issue. You can find more information about that on our website as well at michiganschildren.org. I want to thank Jeff and Rachel. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and please keep up to date with us at Michigan's Children. I know the league does as well. There'll certainly be a lot of opportunities here in the next month for people to weigh in and engage with their elected officials about what your priorities are in the state budget. And hopefully we get not only a budget done by July 1st, but a product that we all can live with at least, and then move forward. And don't forget, this is a huge election year in Michigan, and we're going to be voting for people who are going to be making these decisions again next year, and let's hope we get some better folks in there. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.